Mortise installation for grip to lever. Mark the door. The standard location of the mortise lock is determined by placing the center of the lever at 36 inches above the finished floor. The center of the lock is 1 5/16 inches above the lever. We will mark the door for the lock at 37 5/16 inches above the finished floor. Mark the cavity at 3 1/4 inches above and below the center of the lock faceplate. The faceplate covers 4 inches above and below the center. After making these marks, compare the lock to the marks. Compare lock, hardware trim, and door conditions. So far we've been talking about the vertical location of the trim. Now we're going to verify that the width is adequate to accept the mortise lock and hardware trim. This should be taken into consideration before the hardware is ordered. If we verify before the door is bored, it will not limit our options. It is important that the trim does not interfere with the door stop or astragals, and that the trim does not overlap the door panel or glass. This is decided by a combination of the width of the escutcheon and the backside of the mortise lock. It's recommended to measure the width of the vertical style to ensure that the escutcheon is plumb and square. It is easier to explore our options if we discover a conflict before the door is prepped. Mortise lock cavity. After determining that everything is compatible and the door is marked, we can go ahead and mortise the cavity in the door that will accept the lock body. The door preparatory specification sheet provided with the lock will give you the exact dimensions of the cavity. We recommend using a lock mortising tool as shown, instead of drilling a series of holes and using a chisel to finish. Mortising lock front. After mortising the cavity, we can go ahead and mortise the edge of the door for the lock front. Again, the door preparatory specification sheet will provide all the specific dimensions for the lock front mortise. Cut relief pockets. There's a portion of the 3-pronged latch bolt that travels outside of the lock body. It can be seen on the lock body right at the center of the latch bolt. Once the relief pockets are cut, the latch bolt can retract and return without interference from the lock cavity. Mark face of door. Before we mark the interior and exterior faces of the door, we can cross-check the door preparatory specification sheets with the actual trim and lock mechanism. After verifying that everything matches up properly, the door can be marked for the location and sizes of the holes as shown on the door prep sheets. Check your specification sheets for the correct measurements and mark the door correctly. Make sure that the correct backset is being used. Now that everything is marked correctly, we can go ahead and drill the door. Drill holes. Care must be taken to drill the holes as per the sheet. Do not drill holes all the way through the door if the hole is only needed on one side of the door. The trim may not cover these unnecessary holes. Holes that do go all the way through the door should be drilled from the interior face and then from the exterior. This will ensure that the holes are in the correct location and will avoid blowing out or splintering the faces of the door. Now that all the correct holes are drilled, the door is ready for the lock to be installed. Adjust bevel and install lock. The last step before installing the lock is to adjust the bevel on the lock so that it matches the bevel on the edge of the door, which is typically in the 2 degree to 3 degree range. It is crucial that this step is done correctly because it helps align the lock mechanism with the trim. If it is not done properly, the lock will operate roughly or not at all. To adjust the bevel, loosen the Phillips screws that are located at the top and bottom of the lock body behind the lock front. Care should be taken not to remove the screws. Turning the screws counterclockwise a half turn will be enough to allow the lock front to rotate to match the bevel on the door. Once the bevel on the lock matches the door bevel, tighten the screws so the lock front is held in place. Slip the lock into the door so the bevel can be checked. If the bevel is correct, the distance from the interior face of the lock body to the interior face of the door will match the distance from the exterior face of the door. When the dimensions match up, the lock is square to the door and centered in the cavity. Now that the lock is in the cavity, the pilot holes can be drilled with a Vicks bit or any other self-centering bit. The pilot holes should be the correct diameter. If the pilot is too large, the screws will not hold the lock in place. Small pilot holes can make it easy to strip the head of the screw or break the screw altogether. Once the pilot holes are drilled, the lock can be attached to the door. Grip by lever prep. The thumb piece that operates the latch bolt from the exterior must be trimmed to the correct length. Cut the thumb piece to length so that it fully engages the mechanism in the bottom of the lock body, but will not interfere with the inside wall of the cavity. The half spindle for the lever or knob can be inserted oriented on the diamond from the interior side of the door into the lock body after the screw and washer have been removed. Once the spindle has been slipped into the lock body, the screw and washer can be reinstalled to hold the spindle in place. Install the cylinder. Rotate the swing cover so that the cylinder can be placed through the lock trim. Check for appropriate length. Insert the key halfway into the cylinder so that it can be used as a handle, and carefully thread the cylinder through the lock trim into the lock body. The lock trim does not want to be attached to the door before threading the cylinder into the lock body, as it may interfere with the threading process. If the trim is not attached, it can be moved to allow the cylinder to thread all the way into the lock. The cylinder can be threaded in and out of the lock so that the Rocky Mountain logo is right side up and the cylinder face does not interfere with the swing cover. Tighten the cylinder set screw that is located on the lock front at the edge of the door above the deadbolt. Do not over-tighten the set screw. The cylinder is now in the correct location to operate the lock. The second set screw is only used if there is a double cylinder. Attach exterior lock trim. Once the cylinder has been secured, the exterior lock trim can be installed. The use of a bar clamp will allow the trim to be held in place until it is aligned in all directions, plumb, and working properly. This step should be done before drilling the pilot holes for the escutcheon screws. Once the trim is in the correct position and working properly, drill the pilot holes through the escutcheon with a Vicks bit or any other self-centering drill bit. Make sure that the pilot hole is drilled deep enough to accommodate the whole length of the screw. Thread the escutcheon screws through the trim into the pilot holes and tighten to secure the trim to the door. Attach interior lock trim. Before the interior lock trim can be installed, the turnpiece shank has to be cut to length. The shank should go halfway through the mortise lock body. This ensures solid operation. If the shank is left too long, it will interfere with the far side of the cavity, causing the lock to malfunction. Slip the interior trim into place and verify that the length is okay. The spindle may need to be trimmed. Care should be taken to make sure that the face bores are large enough so that the levers, turn pieces, thumb pieces, and knobs can rotate or operate freely without any interference from the face of the door. Follow the same methods used on the exterior trim and secure the interior trim to the door. Once the trim is in the correct position and working properly, drill the pilot holes through the escutcheon with a Vicks bit or any other self-centering drill bit. Make sure that the pilot hole is drilled deep enough to accommodate the whole length of the screw. Thread the escutcheon screws through the trim into the pilot holes and tighten to secure the trim to the door. Install Scalp. The finished scalp can be attached to the lock front on the edge of the door. It's a good idea at this point to operate the lock through all of the functions with the door open to make sure everything is operating properly.